Hey, Refuge Church. Well, myself and the family right now, we are taking a little break. We are getting some rest. We're getting some time to study, some time to enjoy each other. We miss you for sure, and I cannot wait to be back with you next week. But you are in for a treat. Scott Harland is on staff at Real Life Church, a church that has been instrumental in seeing us hit the ground running. I love Real Life. Scott is a great communicator. He's a gifted pastor, and I'm excited that you get to hear from him today. So when the video ends, put your hands together and give a huge Refuge welcome for Scott Harland.
Awesome. Well, welcome to Refuge. Good morning. As Kyle said, my name is Scott. I'm one of the pastors over at Real Life Church in Santa Clarita. I've been on staff there for 13 years. My wife Lisa's here. We've been married for 17. But man, at Real Life, we love Refuge. We pray for you guys often. We're so excited for what Kyle is doing and the part that Real Life has been able to play within that. And I love coming back to Refuge. My wife and I actually last fall when Refuge launched, I was on sabbatical. We were taking some time away to rest and recharge after a really busy season of transition at Real Life. And as I was returning back on staff in Valencia, we were actually here for the very second service. We missed the first. We were still traveling and doing some road trips on my sabbatical, but we were here for the second service. And so really excited to be back. My wife and I have been looking forward to coming back, and Kyle and I have been talking about weekends that it might work out, and so excited to be here. And man, the parking lot, big change. So excited for the things that are happening here at Refuge. Well, I know that you guys have been in a series kind of looking at different biblical figures throughout the faith and kind of comparing and contrasting them with Jesus. And Kyle had started with Adam and looking at this disobedience and blame that started in the garden, and kind of looking at trust and sacrifice, these characteristics that God calls us to, and then looked at Cain and Abel and this disobedience and murder and kind of evilness that starts to creep in, and the idea of God's justice and God's mercy. We're going to fast forward a little bit through kind of the transition of generations, but from there, things kind of continued this downward spiral for humanity. And we kind of see that disobedience, of violence within the world continues to spread as humanity chases after being God in their own right and choosing to do what they want rather than submitting to God's ways. It gets so bad, it says in Scripture, in the world, that God even got to the point where he was sorry that he had even created humanity in the first place. And that it breaks his heart what was happening within the world. And so we get into some different stories. We see, again, the world gets so bad that God just kind of decides, like, I'm just going to wipe over, fresh slate, start over. But he knows that Noah and his family trust God. And we're following after him. And so he decides to rescue and provide a survival plan for humanity through this one family and Noah. And God, he trusts God and builds this ark and gathers the animals. I think we all heard that story back in, when we were growing up in nursery, and rescues humanity through this family of Noah. But then, as often happens in humanity, like, the downward spiral continues and sin creeps back in and violence starts again. And then we even see where this large city of people starts to gather, and they build this great tower, and they decide, hey, we are going to be like God. And we're going to build a tower up to the heavens. And if we can get up to the place of God, then we can be like God. And so we see this building of this Tower of Babel, and God destroys it and decides that he's just going to scatter the people. He introduces different languages and kind of spreads them out so that they can't work together again to kind of try to be God. And so again, we see this spiral continue, and more generations of violence and evil continue to spread throughout the world. But then, picking up in the story, we get to a guy named Abraham. And so many of us, whether you have ever read the Bible or been introduced to the church, have maybe heard the story of Abraham, or maybe you're familiar with that name, Abraham and Sarah. And the Israelite people trace their lineage back to him. They see him as kind of the father of the Israelite people. And so he is held within the faith of both Israelite custom, but also in Christianity as a hero figure within our faith. And we see him even mentioned, and we see how highly he's regarded in the lineage of faith tradition fathers in our religion in this letter written called Hebrews. And it was an encouragement letter to a group of Christians that were facing persecution, to encourage them to continue on even through persecution and when times get tough, and reminded them of different figures throughout history that put their faith and their trust in God. And this is what it says about Abraham. It says it was by faith that Abraham obeyed God when he was called to leave his home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. And he went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was like a foreigner living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited that same promise. It says Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. So we see Abraham receive this call from God, this invitation to leave his homeland, to leave his people, and to go to an unknown land with the promise that God would bless him and give him an inheritance there. And we see through the faith that Abraham had in God that it says he immediately packed up his stuff, took his family to this land of unknown, chasing after and surrendering his life and his control over to what God had, trusting that God's way was best. Now, it could be really easy to look at the life of Abraham and maybe just this little passage we hear here in Hebrews and think, man, Abraham must have had it all together. And he is highly regarded for his faith, his obedience, his trust. But one of the things that I just love about the Bible is that it never sugarcoats the lives of the people that God uses for his purposes. It could be really easy, again, to look at Abraham and think, man, he must have had it all figured out. But as we look at the story of Abraham, he had the same moral screw-ups that we do, made the same mistakes, the same missteps, struggled with sin, just like we do. And it gives me hope that my mistakes, that your mistakes don't disqualify us from living into and seeing God's purpose and plan for our lives, that God can still use us as broken and as damaged as we are. So before I really take a look at Abraham's life, I figured maybe I'd let you in a little bit on my past. So I grew up in the Catholic faith. My family were super Catholics, if you will. I was Catholic grade school, Catholic high school. I was an altar boy all the way up until I was 18, did all the sacraments all through confirmation, and really learned a whole lot about God. But I got to tell you, as I went through the Catholic faith, I knew who God was, but I also kind of walked away with this misunderstanding, this misrepresentation of God. I kind of saw him as like this cosmic judge in the sky that had these balances of life. And every time I did something bad, every time I made a misstep, everything I did the wrong thing, I kind of tipped the scales against me. And I needed to do good things. I needed to choose good things in life, to do acts of service for others, to good things in God's eyes, to kind of tip the balances back in my favor. And I don't know if you've ever been there where you feel like you're just always chasing after making God happy, of choosing the right thing to make up for all the bad that you've done in life, maybe a karmic type understanding. But it can be exhausting because we never live up to our full potential. We always make missteps in this world. We all struggle with this sin nature inside of us, to compromise, to justify, to do the way that works for everybody else rather than the harder way of following after God. I know growing up and raising myself through childhood, as often many of us do, I struggled with lying, right? And it starts as small things, just not wanting to get in trouble, getting something that I really wanted, getting a good grade on a test by just cheating just a little bit or telling a little lie to get by. And so I became, as I grew up, like a little bit more crafty in my lies. And I learned all right, lying is bad. Like telling a specific lie is bad. But what if I just kind of leave out parts that don't maybe make me look so good? And so I started to get a little creative in my lying or truth-telling, if you will. And my mom, I don't remember the circumstances. I don't know what I did, but I remember the moment my mom pulled me aside to tell me about lies of omission. And she's like, hey, Scott, you know what lying is. You know that we tell you to tell the truth. But it's also important not to leave information out, to let someone make an assumption about something, to tell kind of like a little bit of the truth, but leave the darker parts out and let myself look a little bit better than I am. Like that is still being deceitful. That's lying by omission, not just direct lying. And that's also not good. And I continued to struggle with this fact over the course of my years, and had seasons where maybe I'd get a little bit better and a little bit worse at that. But then as I grew up into adulthood and I got into the workplace, I realized really quickly that this kind of lie of omission, this being creative with the truth, spinning things, it actually gets you ahead in the workplace. It gets you ahead in the world, right? Like we've all been there where we just leave parts out of the story. Now, before you get the wrong idea about Real Life Church, I was not working at Real Life Church. I was not a pastor at the time. I actually followed my family tradition. My parents are both engineers. My twin brother's an engineer. I was good at math and science in school, and so I followed the route of engineering, got my bachelor's in mechanical engineering, and my first job out of college, my first career ended up being kind of in this sales type position where I wasn't working purely as an engineer. I was also working as a salesperson in the team and interfacing with customers. And you can imagine that space within sales. We don't always say that we're going to lie. It's not like a company policy to lie or be creative, but right, if you've been there, you maybe bought a used car before, there's a little bit of space in there for being creative with the truth. And I found myself finding great success in the workplace. Salespeople wanted to work with me. We were getting sales by maybe leaving all the details out of how exactly our product work, or maybe don't tell them that fails some of the time and promote the positive elements. And I remember one time my boss and the owner of the company pulled me into a meeting and let me know, hey, one of our clients has a really big business opportunity. And what they've asked, the company that we're going to visit is in Switzerland, and we'd like you to go out there. And what they've asked is, hey, they want our client to go and explain to them how their products work, and invited them, hey, bring one of your engineers out to show us how the product works. Now, the problem was our customer didn't have engineers of their own. And so they told me, hey, we would like you to go out with our customer to Switzerland and represent yourself as an engineer that works for them. Now, we don't want you to lie. Don't say that you work for them. Don't say that you're an engineer with them. But let them think that. And maybe don't correct them about that. And I remember my mom told me the difference between lying and not telling the truth. But I think in my head, I thought, free trip to Switzerland? I'm not going to pass that up. And it's an opportunity to get ahead in the workplace, maybe get a really big sale for the company. And so I agreed. Went out and represented myself as an engineer, never lied, right? Never said I was an engineer for them, but just kind of let them believe that that's what I did. Now, ultimately, we didn't get the sale. It didn't work out. The product didn't work exactly as we intended it to. And so we came back. But I remember from that moment, I still continued to have this disconnect, this way that I couldn't quite compromise myself. And I started to see more and more opportunities within the workplace where I was being asked to step into uncomfortable situations, to misspeak about our products and what we represented. And as I continued again, I knew who God was, and I then continued to kind of wrestle with this scales mentality of doing a whole lot of wrong and trying to make up for the right. I continued to find myself missettled in that place. And so when a job opportunity came up to leave that company, I jumped on it. And that's what ultimately brought us out to California, what brought us to Real Life Church, and then ultimately a call into ministry as I really started to understand who God was and what a relationship with God looked like. Because that's not really what I had with God. I had more of a transaction with God, of kind of exchanging good for bad, of trying to balance the scales. And that's not what God desires for us, because we will never live up. We will never be able to always do what is right because we have this sin nature within us. and we can never balance the scales on our own. Now, again, ultimately, I got called into ministry to become a pastor at Real Life, but that's a story for another day. We're going to look at the life of Abraham. And I think looking at some of the stories that we see with Abraham, I think he had a little bit of a being creative with the truth flair as well, as we see in some of the stories. And we're going to pick up the story in Genesis 12, where we meet Abram. At the time is his name, and later God changes it to Abraham, which means father of many. But God tells him to leave his country and to move to the land of Canaan, that God is going to make a great nation from him and bless him in order to be a blessing for others. And again, as we saw in Hebrews, it says Abraham immediately picked up and moved on to this country and trusted God's promises for him. And when he arrives in Canaan, God then promises to give this land to him and to his descendants. Now, picking up in verse 10 is, I think, where we start to see Abraham's humanity slip in and his trust in God's protection and provision and promise falter a little bit. It says, at that time, a severe famine struck the land of Canaan, forcing Abram to go down to Egypt, where he lived as a foreigner. And as he was approaching the border of Egypt, Abram said to his wife Sarai, later named Sarah, "Hey, look, you are a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife. Let's kill him, and then we can have her. So please tell them you're my sister, and then they'll spare my life and treat me well because of their interest in you.'" It says, and sure enough, when Abram arrived in Egypt, everyone noticed Sarai's beauty, and when the palace officials saw her, they sang praises to Pharaoh, their king, and Sarai was taken into the palace. And then Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her: sheep and goats, cattle, male, female donkeys, male, female servants, and camels. So we see that what started as a mistruth, a little bit of a lie, maybe not telling the full truth, results in a blessing for Abram. He starts to gather and collect all these possessions, these properties. He's treated well and kindly by the Pharaoh because he believes that this is his sister. This is kind of working toward maybe a marriage proposition of wanting and desiring Sarai and her beauty. And so we see that Abram starts to benefit from maybe not telling the full truth. Ultimately, God ends up putting some curses on Pharaoh, and things start to go bad for them. And ultimately, they realize what's really going on. And somehow they discover that Sarah is not his sister, it's his wife. And so Pharaoh is upset and approaches them and confronts Abraham and says, you guys got to get out of our country. We want God to do us well and remove all these curses that have been placed on us because of what you've done to us. And so they invite them, ask them, force them to leave the country. But for Abraham, he gets to take all of the property and all of the possessions that he had received through this mistruth. And so Abram really ends up benefiting because of what he had done. And the thing about sin, this thing about doing the wrong thing that I've learned, and I think you all know as well, is what starts as one little lie, one little misstep, so often turns into another and another, and it snowballs. And it becomes just a little bit easier to do it again and again. Years ago, I read this book by John Ortberg called Soul Keeping that really challenged me about this idea of don't just focus on the physical, don't just focus on the temporary here in this world. But this is what he says. He says, we are souls. There's an eternal aspect to us. And he says everything is connected. That singular deceit sometimes determines how far we will allow our standards to slip, but still regard ourselves as basically good people. Every act of wrongdoing, of sin, leads to the greater likelihood of another act. Once you rationalize that first sin, it makes it more likely that you will say, it was the traffic, when you know it wasn't the traffic. It makes you more likely to say, I'm sure I sent that email. You know you did not send that email. What starts as one thing compounds into the next, walks us into the next one. It becomes a little bit easier to compromise, a little bit easier to justify, a little bit easier to say, well, what worked before, maybe it'll work again, and to slip further and further into we know what we know is wrong. And this happens to Abraham. We see later in his life, Abraham moved south into the Negev and lived for a while between Kadesh and Shur, and then he moved on to Gerar. And while living there as a foreigner, Abraham introduced his wife Sarah by saying, she's my sister. So King Abimelech of Gerar sent for Sarah and had her brought to him at his palace. Now, in this circumstance, Abimelech, king, actually knew who God was. And God doesn't allow the same misfortune to fall on his household. He reveals to King Abimelech in a dream that Sarah is not his sister, it's his wife. And so Abimelech calls out Abraham and confronts him about the circumstances. And this is how the conversation goes. It says, Abraham replied, I thought, this is a godless place. They will want my wife and will kill me to get her. If she really is my sister, for we both have the same father, but different mothers, right? Like, he actually wasn't totally lying by saying it's his sister, but he was leaving out part of the truth. And he says, I married her. And when God called me to leave my father's home and travel from place to place, I had told her, do me a favor, wherever we go, tell the people that I am your brother. Then Abimelech took some of his sheep and goats and cattle, male and female servants, and he presented them to Abraham. He also returned his wife, Sarah, to him. And then Abimelech said, look over my land, choose any place where you would like to live. And he said to Sarah, look, I'm giving your brother 1,000 pieces of silver in the presence of all these witnesses. This is to compensate you for any wrong that I may have done to you, and this will settle any claim against me, and your reputation will be cleared. Abimelech blesses Abraham because he wants to make sure that they can walk away from this experience without anyone's reputation being tarnished. This is an unbelievable blessing for Abraham, who again stepped into this circumstances without telling the full truth. Saying a partial truth, leaving out the full details in order, like he had done before, to get blessed, and he walks away from this experience with a blessing. Now, I'm not saying either of these men were totally in the right, Pharaoh or King Abimelech, to pull Sarah into their household, to pursue a relationship with them. But at least in some part, their actions were based on the understanding that Sarah was his sister, not his wife. And again, the thing about sin, the thing about mistruths in this world is like that gets us ahead sometimes in life. That's the way this world works so often. Paul, one of the early writers of the New Testament, and wrote and started many churches and wrote letters to encourage them, wrote this to a group of Christians in Rome, and he says this to them: do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. He says, don't conform to the ways of this world. Don't do what gets everyone else ahead in this world by compromising, by justifying, by doing what you as a Christ follower know is wrong, just to get ahead in this world. Don't conform. Be transformed by what God is doing, what he is calling you to, that spirit that is encouraging you, your conscience. And the thing about conforming versus transforming, it is either or. You cannot be one and the other. You are either being transformed or in a process of transformation, or you have conformed. We can't try to do good and bad things in this world and try to justify them. That is conforming to the ways of this world. It is either or. So my question for you with this idea of telling the truth is, are there any areas in your life that may demand greater trustworthiness so that you can trust God more fully? Of speaking the truth, even when it's not convenient. Trusting God to still do what is right, to bless you, to protect you, to provide for you, without conforming to the ways of this world. Because the thing about deceit It does damage our relationships, our trustworthiness with others, but it also damages our trust in God by trusting ourselves, by our ability to make up lies or practice mistruths, rather than trusting God and his provision and his protection. Now, sometime later, we see Abraham has continued to be blessed by God with this growing community, with livestock, with possessions, and God again speaks to Abraham, reminding him of this promise that he had made and the provisions and protection that God had promised to Abraham. To which Abraham responds, "O sovereign Lord, what good are all these blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eleazar of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You've given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir." Then the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky, count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants that you will have." It says, Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. He trusted God's promise. Again and again, he had seen that God was trustworthy, that God provided, that God did what he said he would. At this point in Abram's life, he's about 80 years old, struggling with never having children, a son of his own. And God makes him a promise. You will have a son that will be your heir. And then time happens. We don't know exactly how long, but we see time continue to progress, and Abram still doesn't have a son. Have you ever been in those circumstances? Maybe you're praying for something to happen and hoping and praying and trusting that something's going to move, but time continues to move by. Maybe you had a sense or an inkling that God's going to do something and he's preparing you for something. And then time keeps happening and it keeps not happening. And you start to wonder, you start to doubt. Has God forgotten what he said? Has God forgotten me? Does he even remember what he said? It says, and then Abram and Sarai, they, like so many of us do, they take the wheel. They make their own way. It says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, and she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. And so Sarai said to Abram, the Lord has prevented me from having children, so go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. And so Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as his wife. And it says that Abram sleeps with Hagar, and they have a child, and they name him Ishmael. But this one decision to play God, to take control, ends up having dramatic repercussions for the family. First, it ends up driving a wedge between Sarah and her servant. Sarah begins to mistreat her, have contempt for her, for what she was able to do that Sarah never was able to. Enough to the point that Hagar ends up running away, fleeing into the desert to get away from this mistreatment. Ishmael, her son, ends up being revealed by God to grow up into a wild man and an untamed donkey. God ends up saying about Ishmael that his descendants will be hostile to his relatives, the Israelite people. We see decades and generations of violence and mistrust between Ishmael's descendants and the descendants later of Abraham. This one act of control ends up having violent and painful repercussions for generations to come. Now it says years later in Abraham and Sarah's story that the Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant. She gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age, and this happened at just the time God said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac. 8 days later, Isaac was born. Abraham circumcised him, and God has commanded. And then Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So they had taken what God had promised to them, and they had decided to move the timeline up to fit their timeline. They had chosen to go their own direction rather than what God had said he would do and produce this heir named Ishmael. But then later, God is faithful to what he had said and produces the true heir, Isaac, for Abraham and Sarah. Now, we don't know exactly if God had revealed to Abraham when this would take place, but in this passage, it does tell us, one, God did what he said he had promised. But then two, it happened just at the time God had said. Have you ever taken action because you think God's calling to you to something and maybe you get a little impatient about it? And you decide, well, maybe I think God's calling me to do this thing now, and you take action. So my invitation for you is this: are there actions, if you look at your life right now, are there actions you are taking based on your timeline rather than God's? It may be big things, it may be small things. I know for me that often I find myself running after, living into the hustle and bustle of life and asking God to bless the things that I'm doing. And then realize I've never asked God for direction. He never told me to do this thing. Am I really following God's way or my way and asking him to tag along and bless me for what I want to do? Sometimes God doesn't always give us direction. He does give us options to choose. But the invitation, are we seeking God's way or are we just going ours? Now, despite his flaws, Abraham is still regarded, again, as a hero of the faith for his obedience and his trust. And I think so often his trust, his obedience, his faith was based on the relationship that God had with Abraham. We see through all these missteps and mistakes that God continued to speak into him, to share with him, to direct him, to guide him, that they maintained the relationship throughout. And I think we get a little bit of a peek into what this relationship between Abraham and God looked like. Now, God reveals to Abraham there's these cities called Sodom and Gomorrah that are doing just utter violence and things that detestable in God's sight. And he's decided to wipe these cities off the map. But for Abraham, his cousin Lot and his cousin's family live in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he has a conversation with God that ends up turning into a little bit of a negotiation. And he says, God, hey, aren't you good? Don't you love your creation and your people? Would you wipe out all of these cities? If there's any righteous people that live there, what if there's 50 righteous people that live in that city? Would you wipe them out? And God says, okay, for 50 people, I won't wipe out the city. And I think Abraham senses there's a little bit of space here. And as a good salesman, he says, well, what about 45? There's 45 good people. Okay, for 45, God says. How are 40? 30? 20? Ultimately, he works his way down to 10, and we see finally Abraham said to the Lord, Lord, please don't be angry if I speak just one more time. Suppose there's only 10 that are found. The Lord replied, then I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. Now, unfortunately, for Sodom and Gomorrah, there were not 10 righteous people that lived there. The cities are destroyed to bring God's justice and judgment onto that city for the evil that they had been doing. But Lot and his daughters were rescued by God's angels from that city. And what always reminds me about this story, that for the sake of righteous people, that others might be saved, always reminds me of the story and the sacrifice of Jesus. That for the sake of one righteous person, not just a city was saved, but the entire world was offered salvation. Just as Abraham struggles and we struggle with telling the truth. We know this about Jesus from Peter, one of his closest followers and leaders in the church. It says he, Jesus, never sinned. He never deceived anyone. Where we, just as Abraham, struggle with God's timing, with God's plans, we seek to wrestle control, to take control. It says that Jesus trusted God's plan. Kyle shared with us and reminded us 2 weeks ago of the story of the Garden of Gethsemane, the night Jesus was betrayed, ultimately going to the cross to die for us. It says that Jesus submitted fully to God's plan of sacrifice. It says he went on a little further, bowed down with his face to the ground, praying, "My Father, if it's possible, let this cup of suffering be taken from me. Yet, I want your will, not mine." We see that Jesus fully submitted, where Abraham took timing into his own way, chose the ways of this world to get ahead, to find provision and protection, just like we do. Jesus did not take that route. He always chose the higher path. He trusted God to do what is right, trusted God that his plans, his ways are better than our ways. And he fully trusted God's character and his promises in life. And so the invitation for us is the same. Do we trust that God's ways are better than our ways? That even if it's inconvenient, we tell the truth, and whatever may come from that, that God will still provide justice and give us mercy. Would you pray for me, with me? Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for this evidence of God, a way that we can trust and follow you. God, it is so easy in this world to conform to the patterns of this world. God, when we enter into the workplace, into our schools, into our neighborhoods and our families, it is so easy to compromise, to justify, to choose the lower road, because in this world that often gets us ahead. And God, when we sense that you are about to do something, God, we get so impatient sometimes and take control and choose our ways rather than trusting your timing and your plan. So God, help us. God, that we would seek after trustworthiness, that would help us to trust you more, that we would trust and have patience in your plan, that we would be able to see through fulfillment, God, what you are going to do in this world and in our lives. God, be with us this week and give us opportunities to hear, to trust, and to obey. And God, we pray these things in your Son's name. Amen.